Chapter 2 of Lady Jane Grey. The September sun warmed my thoughts, pulling me along the sidewalk down Forest Avenue. Forest Avenue was an important road in Staten Island. It crossed the northern shore, the widest part of the island. I always thought of Staten Island as heart-shaped, the heart center of everything. It was close to the most famous city in the country and the most important country in the world. New York City, USA. Forest Avenue connected the Goethals Bridge, the bridge that connected us to Elizabeth, New Jersey, and then crossed the north end of the island to St. George and the Staten Island Ferry. Our Staten Island Ferry was just a boat ride for many visitors to New York City. They got to experience New York Harbor and the New York City skyline. It cost only a nickel, and most tourists went right back to New York City without bothering to spend any time in Staten Island. But for us, the ferry was the lifeline to the city, and Forest Avenue led to the ferry. Forest Avenue was like the path that led to everywhere on the island. It was the path we started on to go to the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, or Tottenville Beach on the South Shore, to Port Richmond, our groceries and shoes, or to PS 22, my elementary school. And it was all connected to my home. Staten Island connected to New York City, the biggest and best city in the world. Walking home along Forest Avenue was one of the finest things to do on a beautiful day. It was about 1.5 miles from my school to home. A mile with small shops and apartments along the street and woods and open spaces behind them. The walk home always went fast, as good weather as there were in good weather, went fast in good weather as there were things to see and people to watch. I was just getting into a meditative and relaxed stride when I heard a toot and looked up to see my school bus with Jim, the bus driver, lifting his hand in a small salute as he passed by. I felt a little bad about not taking his bus today and resolved to take the bus the next day. He had been our bus driver for years and always had a friendly word for each of us, greeting us by name as we got on the bus. I thought about how Jim and I became friends and learned of our mutual love of horses. The previous winter, on one of those rare balmy days of January when I was in the 5th grade, I had stayed at home with some sort of stomach virus that cleared up by early afternoon. I thought it would be fun to meet my neighborhood chums, Jackie, Patty, and Dennis McMorrow, with my big half-Percheron bay horse, Pat, at the bus stop when they came home from school. I rode up to Elizabeth Grove Road and waited on the little hill at the bus stop. As Pat and I stood on the sidewalk on Forest Avenue, cars tooted and I waved. When the bus finally came, Jackie leaped off the bus with Patty and brother Dennis close behind. They began petting Pat and cooing and chattering together. I realized as I towered above them that Jim, the bus driver, was smiling at us and was saying, "I'll tell you about my horses tomorrow," as he closed the doors. The next day, I sat behind the driver's seat, and Jim and I talked horses the whole trip home. That seat became my seat, and I continued to sit there for the rest of the year. As I continued the rutted sidewalk along Forest Avenue that first day of 6th grade, I passed Danny's barber shop, where I had my hair cut. I slowed to a stop and looked at the pony chair next to the window. I loved that pony chair. I would sit quietly on it and pretend my pony and I were riding on a trail that opened out on this range like the Lone Ranger and Silver on television. Now, when I had a haircut at Danny's, I sat in the big girl chair like all the adults. I looked deeper into the shop. Danny was busy, but not so busy he couldn't catch me looking and then smile and wave. I waved at Danny and slowly moved on. In a bit, I passed Fury's Grocery, where our family only shopped in emergencies. Shop at the A&P, my father told us over and over again. It's much cheaper. That's the nature of capitalism. The bigger the business is, the cheaper the price. These poor bastards, these little businesses struggle to stay in business. They can't compete on the scale of the A&P, but we can't afford to pay the jacked up prices that they need to charge in order to survive. My parents were devoted communists, and my father took every opportunity to teach a lesson on economics, capitalism, and communism. He would go on at length and in such detail that I learned to nod and stare and wait for the end. Mercifully, he never tested me on whether I was really listening, and I could get away with not really listening. I could go into some other place in my mind where lectures were background music. The biggest reason that I wanted to walk home that day, other than the beautiful weather, was that I might see Lady. Lady was a horse that was kept on an old farm just off Forest Avenue. Everyone called it Vitale's farm. Old man Vitale lived in the house and had a barn that he rented to Lady's owner. It used to be a dairy farm, but now it was called a truck farm. Long Island was filled with truck farms where the famous Long Island potatoes were grown. There weren't that many truck farms left on Staten Island. I picked up my stride as I came closer to the farm, and Lady's beauty became more and more real to me. She was a tricolor pinto horse, brown, black, and white, with a long tricolor mane and tail. When her owner, Herman Day, rode her, she pranced like a parade horse, her head high, her feet clipping and dancing over the ground. She was magnificent. I pictured her grazing in her field, and then raising her head, pricking her ears towards me as she saw me nearing. She would be standing like a goddess, the wind picking up and flowing through her mane and tail, and the tall yellowing grasses brushing her flanks. I knew I was getting closer to Lady as I passed Mary's corner shop, where I sometimes went with friends for penny candy. I reached into my pocket to see if I could get a couple of Mary Janes. I pulled out 1 penny. Going in to get 1 penny candy just didn't feel right. Mary would have to come from her back room, or if she was up front, she would have to push her considerable heft up from the chair that was her spot in the corner. The nearness of Lady pulled me past Mary's store, and I began to look for Lady in her field. So clearly had I seen her in my mind in all her splendor that I stopped and stared when I reached her field. It was empty. I moved toward the barbed wire fence, looking for movement. Perhaps she was lying down. Herman Day usually came only on weekends. If I wanted to see her in her saddled and mounted beauty, I always had to come midday on a Saturday. That was the best time. I clutched my books against my chest and lifted the wire so that I could step through. Walking along the path in the field that Lady had made with her hooves, I headed towards the barn. Her path always gave me a thrill. She had passed over it hundreds of times. Here were her hoof prints that had worn the trail between the grasses that brushed my legs. Her prints seemed fresh, a pile of manure, still moist, not even beginning to dry and shrink, showed the hay and grain within. I loved the smell of horse manure and loved to see horse prints and worn trails. It always showed me a real horse had been there, and now my lady had been here recently. Have you ever known anybody that's crazy for horses? Well, I'm not now. I seem to have outgrown it. Actually, that's not true. I really do get a kick out of seeing horses. But there are a lot of, I don't know why, it seems to be mostly teenage girls. And I've had them in my class. I always have one or two every year. And they're just nuts. They like the smell of horses. They like to brush horses. That was me. As I neared the barn, I saw her, all saddled up and standing as Herman Day was just beginning to mount. She backed away, and Herman jerked at her bit. I stopped and watched as Lady backed further, and Herman yelled, "Stand still, you crazy bitch!" slashing at her legs until she had backed against the barn wall. Herman leaped on her back, and Lady leaped forward. Jerking on the reins, he backed her against the wall again, and she danced up against the barn. Herman moved her forward and rode her down and back the long dirt driveway, passing the tomato plants on the right, going down the driveway, and the broccoli on the right coming back up. Lady jigging and prancing all the way. Thankful for the tall grasses that hid me, I moved a bit closer and crouched down, still unnoticed, as Herman Day rode up and down the driveway a few times, jerking at Lady's mouth and shouting at her to walk. She only pranced higher, occasionally jumping forward and then sideways. "Walk!" Herman shouted as he jerked again at her mouth and brought the reins against her shoulders. Coming back up the driveway, he pulled her to a stop and jumped off. Lady backed away, and Herman followed her, backing her into the barn. Banging and cursing continued from within the barn until there was silence. I waited from my spot behind the weeds, afraid to move. Finally, Herman Day came out with the saddle and bridle, threw them into the back of the truck, jumped inside, turned it on, and spun his wheels out as he took off down the driveway. Quiet settled over the fields, and I entered the dark, windowless barn. "Hi, Lady." Her nostrils flared as she watched me, her sides heaving and dripping with sweat. She had always greeted me before with a welcoming nicker when I stopped by for my visits. Now she looked at me like she had never seen me before. I spoke softly for a long time, and then began to sing. "I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me." Lady's eyes followed mine as I sang. Her nose relaxed and no longer flared, but she kept sniffing at the air, her head bobbing nervously. When I finished Joe Hill, I began another song. "Old Man River, he can't do nothing." Her breathing began to slow, and she took a step towards me. I reached out to touch her nose. She sniffed for a while, and then let me touch her nose, then her neck, and then her back. As I stroked her, she relaxed under my hand and stepped towards me and lowered her head. "I have to go home now, lady, but I'll be back soon." I left her there and turned to see her eyes following me out of the barn.